John Winthrop, first governor of Massachusetts Bay, was, according to his Yale biographer, America's first great man. In 1630, he led the first major migration of English people to the New World and founded the third and most successful colony there, over 20,000 people by the 1640s. Winthrop represents a persistent thread in American culture, how religion and secular culture relate to each other. Citizens today who strive to maintain religious influence over American life have a guide in Winthrop's example. Christian involvement in American politics and culture began in the Store Valley in England, home for the Winthrops. That area had been heavily influenced by the Reformation. Local government in Winthrop's area had godly magistrates, lay people like Winthrop, who were believers, lawyers, business people, or aristocrats. In England, Winthrop himself had been a magistrate. When Winthrop and other Puritans came to New England in 1630, they brought that seamless spiritual and civic union with them. They were conscious of the challenge to maintain balance. Early colonists were church members and voters. A network of churches, pastors, and laity encouraged civic accountability. Advocating religious liberty and religious control over society was not a contradiction for Winthrop. Massachusetts Bay was a voluntary society. The central issue was how to be in the world and be holy. He saw that isolation was not the answer. Edmund Morgan, Yale historian, summarized Winthrop's dilemma: doing right in a world that does wrong. That dilemma is the Christian's dilemma today. Two sermons reveal what Puritans emphasized. One Winthrop preached, although a layman, at the outset of a voyage to the New World in 1630. It describes what the colonists should be, his vision for the colony. The sermon, a model of Christian charity, included symbolism popularized by President Ronald Reagan, and in 1999, a Harvard chaplain declared it the most important sermon in American history. Preaching from Matthew 5:14, Winthrop declared, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." He said believers exercising love for each other would build a Christian community and set the example of religious influence over culture. Puritans came to the New World to evangelize. Their spiritual mission was more important to them than their business. They came to pursue religious liberty after the opposition from Charles I. Winthrop thought as an Englishman, as part of the empire, but he also saw himself as part of a spiritual kingdom. And he thought secular government should reflect congregational church government. 40 years after Winthrop's sermon, a second sermon, Aaron into the Wilderness, described what the colonists should do, which was to recommit to their spiritual purpose, or Aaron. Preached in 1670 by Pastor Samuel Roxbury, it was in part a reflection on a political election, a challenge to reform society because it is evil. Puritans, though, too wrestled with morality. Balance between work and spiritual life was important. The Sabbath was strictly observed, but recreation was flexible. While drunkenness was punished, drinking alcohol was an acceptable pleasure. Hunting, sports, music, and theater were permitted, but not boxing or cockfights. They were more flexible on divorce than later Victorians. Purity for the church was also a challenge. Balance was always the goal there as well, not extreme separation like Roger Williams or heresy like Anne Hutchinson, but rather living uprightly amid surrounding unrighteousness. Winthrop was pragmatic in this regard. He helped a French Catholic governor in Arcadia defend his settlement. It would not have been good or wise to refuse solely on religious differences. Many criticized Puritans for their too close church and state connection, but their framework was instead one of religious influence over culture, not a church-state. Contemporary America looks primarily at race and gender to define American identity. Historians cite major events as shaping America. However, for a truer understanding of what shaped American identity, one must look to figures like John Winthrop. He never lost his vision for building and maintaining a model of how to be a light in the world. The Puritan idea of religious influence over culture was so well established that it endured until the late 1800s. For example, beginning in the 1830s, evangelicals led the campaign against slavery through the American Anti-Slavery Society. They provided leadership and money. In addition to the abolition of slavery, Northern evangelicals advocated legal and religious equality for African Americans. Much later, the influence was still being felt. Given the threat of international communism during the early Cold War, according to some historians, President Eisenhower promoted religion in the culture. Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism, he proclaimed. Without God, there could be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. In that spirit, Congress in 1954 added, "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and 2 years later, "In God We Trust" to the coins, and made that phrase the national motto.